she was definitely not a Broadway baby. The only daughter of a subway motorman and a housewife, she was raised Irish Catholic in Manhattan's Garment District, where, as she likes to tell it, her choices were to get married, to become a nun, or work for the telephone company. Welcome to Women in Theater. I'm Linda Weiner, theater critic and arts columnist of Newsday. And our guest is Elizabeth Ireland McCann, who for almost 4 decades has worked her way up through the male-dominated Old Broadway to become the only woman who plays hardball with the big guys, and does it with the quality plays, I might add. Is it too boring for you to tell us how this happened?
You mean how I ended up on Broadway?
From there to here?
I think it happened... oh dear. I think many careers in the theater are born. I mean, I was an only child. I was a lonely child. That is a kind of common denominator, I think, of a lot of people in the theater. And when I was, my parents, we never went to the theater. I mean, I didn't have one of those careers where people are always saying, you've got to take children to the theater, you've got to nurture them in the theater.
And what were you, 5 blocks away?
Yeah, no, we never went to a Broadway theater. We went to the movies. And sometimes the movies on Times Square. I used to love to go to the New Amsterdam because they had all that wonderful filigree stuff of Shakespeare plays through the lobby and everything. But we never went to a play. We had little school plays that the nuns put on. They were my first producers, I'm fond of saying. And but I never went to the theater till I was about 14 or 15, and a cousin came in from New Jersey and had a spare ticket to Cyrano de Bergerac with Jose Ferrer. And
not a bad start.
Yeah, well, I thought, oh, it sounds foreign. I mean, there was a slight, Irish Catholic street sort of, is that the same as Italian? No, it's English. Oh, I don't know what it is. Anyway, I couldn't pronounce his name. I wasn't very sure of the title of the play, and it was not something I wanted to do. But my mother made me go because my cousin had a spare ticket. And she'd come all the way from New Jersey, and her girlfriend was sick, and the usual. So I went to see Jose Ferrer and Cyrano, and that was it. I mean, it was just magic. And from then on, I wanted to see theater. I mean, now, that took some saving up of allowances to kind of, save pennies and buy a $3 seat or something. But it just blew me away, that production. I always say, and years later when I did Cyrano with the Royal Shakespeare and Derek Jacobi, it's a great play for an adolescent girl. It's got all the romance, and it's a real old potboiler clink. And sometimes I think that when we struggle to introduce children to theater, we either take them to musicals, which is fine, or we take them to like David Mamet or something. Now, David is fine, but if you really want to hook a kid, take them to a melodrama, or take them to see Front Page, or take them to see something that's big.
The first one that meant anything to me was The Caretaker, which explains a lot about me, right?
Right.
Pinter.
Yeah. Right. I mean, I wouldn't start a child on Pinter. How old were you? No, I shouldn't ask.
Never mind. Yeah.
Anyway, but it's harder going. Yeah. Now, even as I said, musicals, the best talk Edward Albee ever gave, which I'm sorry you missed, was he talked to the road managers, and I couldn't think to myself why in God's name I had arranged for Edward to talk to road entrepreneurs who knew nothing about his theater. And he spoke about the real theater of the absurd was Hellzapoppin'. And he spoke about going to see Jumbo as a little kid and loving the elephant. So, that is how it starts. And then when I got out of college, I just kind of wanted to be in the theater, and I didn't kind of know how to do it. How do you get a job in the theater? I mean, I knew how to get a job on the subways, and I knew how to get a job in the telephone company. And my cousin said, oh, go get a job in an ad agency. They produce television shows. So I got a job in an ad agency, but that wasn't very interesting. And then one day there was a little story in the paper saying a group of kids from the University of Wisconsin was starting a theater in Greenwich Village. So
Cherry Lane?
Cherry Lane. So I went down to the Cherry Lane.
It was in the 50s?
Yeah, late 50s.
Late 50s?
They were doing something called Thieves' Carnival. And I asked for a job, and they looked at me like I was rather crazy because, no, I could come and work, but they couldn't pay me. I mean, it was real way you get started in theater, and that's what happened. I went, and eventually they paid me $5 a week, and eventually they paid me $25 a week, so I quit my job at the ad agency, and, you know, it was just kind of the way things happen in the theater. One person says, "Oh, you're looking for something? I know so-and-so in such an office is looking for something." I mean, it's kind of like when young people come to me and they say, "Well, is there any place I could get a job in the theater?" I say, "Well, go talk to some of the kids in the office," because they know where every job in the theater is. You know, they're their own network. And as everything in life, as your career advances, you know, the director you work with at the Cherry Lane, his career goes forward, so he kind of pulls you along with him. And that's basically what happened. And I got totally and absolutely, and am still hooked. I mean, I like strange things. I like being able to walk through the door of a theater and not have a ticket. Oh, I just love that, because I know all the ushers. And I love just walking in the middle of the first act and watching a piece of a play, or watching from the wings. I mean, I'm hopeless about all that thing. That I can get into a theater now without a ticket is really important to me. I mean, it's a status symbol.
Well, you say you like strange things, but you also have back plays that people say you must be joking.
Yes, I think that the thing that I think keeps most of us in this business is it's always full of surprises. The thing that everybody thinks is going to work will not. The thing that nobody thinks will work will. And it's kind of the craziness of it. Out of nowhere, something appears. I went to see Dem Poetry Jam the other night.
Deaf Poetry Jam?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I had been told by the kids in my office I wasn't going to like it. They loved it, but I wasn't going to like it. And I had the best time at in the theater in forever. And there is this surprisingly wonderful show full of youth and energy and vitality and a love of language. I mean, those kids up on that production loved the sound of language. And they're poets. And that's what basically playwrights are. They're poets. They're having a love affair with the language. It started with Shakespeare, as they say. But the interesting thing about it is Tennessee Williams started out as a poet. Edward Albee started off writing poetry. They were all bad poets who became playwrights. But
that's what you always look for, is the word, right? I mean, you're not a musical director. You've done a few. Leader of the Pack, I was the only one who liked. But basically, your real track record is in serious plays. And you look for playwrights with language.
Well, I think that language in the theater is a tricky proposition because it's not like language in screen or film. It's really, when you say it's got to have a theatricality to it, it's got to have poetry in it, it's got to kind of, the example I usually use when I'm talking to younger people is, who says attention must be paid? What is that? I mean, you go to your husband's funeral and you say attention must be paid? No. I mean, and you'll never forget that line, or you'll never forget, I've always depended on the kindness of strangers. Who ever says that? I mean, theater language is very different than television and movie language. I mean, anybody can write dialogue for television. But you have to kind of have words that soar, that carry the actors with them. And that's the kind of play I like.
In recent years, you've had a wonderful relationship with Edward Albee, starting with Three Tall Women?
Mm-hmm.
With Three Tall Women and his first Pulitzer Prize in a number of years, his first popular success and critical success in a number of years.
First popular and critical success in a lot of years. And I mean, that happens. I've been spending some time lately with Neil Simon, sort of in a strange capacity. And he has a new play. And you realize that what these writers go through is they're in vogue and then they're out of vogue. Are they out of vogue, or have they just gotten scared and they're not writing as well as they did. I don't know what.
Isn't that what Edward said in The Man Who Had Three Arms? It was this was a monologue about a man who had 3 arms, and he was very famous, and the arm fell off, and no one cared about him anymore. I always felt it was a metaphor maybe for the way Edward was feeling at the time.
And it may be, you know, because Neil Simon was certainly, and is, not was, is, a highly successful American playwright. Probably with his best work up there on a par with Kaufman and Hart. You know, he really is. Last few years, his work has been disappointing. It doesn't mean the writer is not there still.
Is it his work, or is it the tastes have changed?
Well,
is there really still an appetite for that particular kind of comedy? Has that audience gone?
Well,
can you get that on television?
Boy, when you get into a discussion, Linda, about comedy,
sorry,
that's really a tough one, because it is the big cultural divide, I think, is comedy, and how the young people respond to it as opposed to how I respond to it. I mean, I don't know. I'm sort of sorry we kind of got down the Neil Simon path, because to me, he's a writer who needs, you know, he needs someplace like the Signature. That's where Neil should be.
Right.
Exactly
Where they could really discover his work again as a body of work.
And be a writer and give us a body of work.
Yeah.
Don't, you know, let's see that wonderful play he wrote years ago for Maureen Stapleton, The Gingerbread Lady. Wasn't it The Gingerbread Lady? Right.
Right.
I mean, there are always, within the canon of any writers, these little gems or jewels that kind of, they weren't in fashion at the time, and they, you know, and Neil, I think, desperately needs to have that kind of embrace to say, all of your work is worth our consideration.
And is that what a producer does? You look at bodies of work. How much of what you do is
sometimes it's very dangerous
creative
for the body of works.
Yeah.
I said to Edward, seeing a play of his in London called On the Beach, I said, that speech is strangely familiar. I think it's in Three Tall Women. Because he said, oh, you are getting too familiar with my work. And yeah, I mean, sometimes they pilfer a little from their past.
Yeah. Well, talking about comedy and changes of comedy, also a lot of the comedy used to be Jewish comedy. And the producers were not only men when you came into the theater, but they're Jewish men. And here's this little Irish Catholic girl. Were you like a mascot? Did you amuse them? I know they called when you were working, when you had your partnership with Nell Nugent, very productive partnership for 10 years. And first, I read that they called you the girls, and then eventually, since you started making money, they called you the ladies. But how is it that you became a player in this world that still has no women in the hierarchy of the 3 major, unless there's some women in the hierarchy I don't know about, but I would say that they're still male-dominated, the Schuberts, the Niederlanders, Drew Jansen, and then if we go into the corporates now, Disney is, Clear Channel, these people are all, it's all still a very male-dominated
Clear Channel
thing.
has a very interesting young producer working for them named Beth Williams. Jerry Schoenfeld has a very interesting woman named Des Moynihan, who basically is his, head advisor in artistic matters. But they don't tend to let women into the real power, which is where the money is. You know, it's kind of, that's a little bit off guard. I mean, it's sort of like, well, when you're going to make tough decisions, they got to be made by us, you know. And I think men are the most reckless people I know with money, but that's another story. That's a whole philosophical discussion. The theater, to a large extent, as indeed was the Austrian theater, come to think of it, male and Jewish, and that was because, you know, in Austria or wherever it was, one of the few professions open to Jews was theater. So they were good at what they could do. And that's kind of like the reverse of Copenhagen. They became analytical physicists because no one would let them become theoretical physicists. And so...
Copenhagen, of course, a play that you produced that everyone said, this cannot be...
Yeah, and interestingly enough, you know, you were talking earlier about the difference between the West End and New York. Copenhagen was a much bigger success in the United States than it was in England, ever.
This is Michael Frayn's three-character play about physics,
the atom bomb.
about the atom bomb. How do you explain that?
Well, it touched a great many nerves in this country. The first obvious nerve was the scientific community. And it was kind of fascinating because there was an enormous... It's the first time within memory that we had a full page in the science section of the New York Times before we opened. I mean, this had been one of the great dilemmas to the scientific community. We'd walk into the theater on a Sunday afternoon, we'd have 2 Nobel Prize winners and physicists in the audience. So that there was a sudden outpouring of scientific interest, which didn't seem to happen so much in England. But every physics class in New York was sending its students to see this play. And then there was a great deal of interest from the Jewish community because of the issue of the Holocaust and where that fell. And then, you know, there was an enormous amount of interest. I was amazed. I've seen more Asians at the theater in Copenhagen, which I decided must be because they were all eager young scientific students from one of the better colleges or high schools in New York. So it kind of cut across a very big swath of New York, which it didn't in London.
When you look at your track record, there's many of these unlikely successes. Most recently, Edward Albee's The Goat, deciding to put such a play on Broadway, and ending up hanging in there long enough to see it actually become a critical and popular success. But there was Amadeus. There was Nicholas Nickleby, which to me is still one of the peak experiences of my life, where for 7 hours, you brought in the Royal Shakespeare Company for 7 hours to do Nicholas Nickleby. The ticket price at that time was $100, and you actually got the cowmen and the farmers to be friends. You got the Schuberts and the Nederlanders to work together on this. How did you do that?
Well, first of all, it's interesting about that $100 ticket, you know, because there were 2 plays.
But do people see it that way?
No, well, in those days, I mean, you know, Jimmy Nederlander had a long-time relationship with the Royal Shakespeare Company.
Okay, and you worked for a long time for Jimmy Nederlander before you and Nell broke off in...
Jimmy had a relationship with the Royal Shakespeare Company, and he got first call on all their material.
Okay.
The Royal Shakespeare Company didn't want to play a Nederlander theater that was available. They wanted a Schubert house that was available because they thought it would work better for the play, and the Royal Shakespeare Company was right. The third thing that was difficult is the Royal Shakespeare Company did not want to come. They did not think it could be done. The logistics could be done. So my partner's job was to convince the Royal Shakespeare Company, and my job was to convince Bernie Jacobs and Jimmy Nederlander that they should work together. Now, in those particular days, there was a lot of antagonism between the theater owners. It doesn't exist so much anymore, partly because people are older, but partly also because there's so much product that no one's going to get into a fight over a property anymore. I mean, they've got more than they need on their plates. But in those days, when both theater chains were struggling, I mean, they'd kill to get a booking, but I think they both recognized, and Jimmy is very shrewd about this in a way, and so is Bernie, that it was a good idea for the theater to have this. This could be an event that would focus interest on the theater. And they understood that. And so they got together.
That they would do something for prestige.
Well, they didn't expect to make any money. In point of fact, they got all their money back. They never made any money, but they recovered the cost of bringing the company to the United States. But it was very much, I think, a point at which they thought, this gamble pays off, it's going to make theater interesting in this town again. And I think that many reasons is why they did it.
If you could say 3 things that you think have changed, basic things that have changed in the theater since you started seriously working in the mid-60s, and then I guess around 76 broke off and produced Dracula, and then Elephant Man, Mornings at 7, and things that how is it different now? Because it is very different, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. It's very, very different, and in a funny way, the theater did have its roots sort of in the Lower East Side, in that theater tradition. It was a family kind of sense of business. As a matter of fact, APAM, the union, that local, started in the Yiddish theater. And there was some kind of homogeneous sense of family. I think in a way it's why I got attracted to it in another kind of dynamic, because in a strange world, although everybody announces I'm Irish, I wasn't really Irish. My father was born in Scotland, my mother was born in England, of Irish parentage, but they were not Irish, and they did not speak with an Irish accent, and they didn't have any Irish relatives over here, so that when I went to school, I can remember little kids calling me Limey, because, my mother spoke with an English accent, and there was that Irish feeling.
Is that why your middle name is Ireland?
My middle name is Ireland because my Scotch Presbyterian grandmother was called Elizabeth Ireland. That's why the name is Ireland. But anyway, so I never felt truly at home in what would seem to have been my natural ethnic environment. In the meantime, my parents were off living in the garment district. That's another story. And there weren't many kids in the garment district, so I used to basically get on my roller skates and roller skate around the garment district, and I kind of knew everybody. I knew the people. I knew hat trimmers and people who made cigars, and there was this kind of warmth there because I was a kid that I never sort of felt in my own environment. So I think the thing that I came away from it, strangely enough, was I remember Bernie Jacobs saying to me once, it's a shtetl. That's what it is. It's a shtetl, and we let one goyim in, and you're it. Yeah. I mean, that was it. I mean,
there was always a pushcart mentality there.
Always.
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
It was very much of New York.
Yes.
When you talk about these big corporations coming into Broadway and is it going to ruin it, that sort of sense of what New York was coming out of the Depression and the war years, and this small community who was still turning out dreams. I mean, it was, and that has all sort of changed. My God, we have managers who got their degrees from Yale. I mean, most of the managers in my day, and some of the finest, had started off as candy butchers.
Yes. Of course, you have a law degree, right?
Yeah.
That was an afterthought?
Well, I wasn't getting very far in the theater. I mean, I really couldn't get arrested in the theater. So I figured if I had known that there were a lot of women lawyers in the theater business, like Floria Lasky, who's very well known, who represented Jerry Robinson, still is active, but there was a group of women lawyers. And interestingly enough, even Floria, she was graduated the highest in her class in law school. She couldn't get a job on Wall Street. So the only place she could get a job, she wasn't interested in the theater, the only place she could get a job was this small Jewish firm that happened to have an entertainment practice. But there were a number of women, and I thought, that's what I'll do. I'll go to law school. I'll become Floria Lasky. Well, by the time I got out of law school, I was 35, and all these firms that did theater business were very small, so there weren't very many openings. So there was no job. That had been a dead end, except for Jimmy Niederlander, because Jimmy Niederlander had always wanted to go to law school. So he thought anybody that went to night law school in their 30s had to be very interesting. So I was hired by Jimmy Niederlander because I went to law school, which is what he always wanted to do, which makes no sense. The very few things, the theater is a business of strange sort of accidents. And I think that I kind of, it's an emotional moment for me, but I kind of get a kick out of people in the theater. When we did The Goat with Sally Field, I was trying to get out of her why she loved the theater so. And she said to me, well, my crazy Aunt Betty was an usher. I said, when you were in California? Yeah, she said, well, my father left us and came back east, and he had a crazy Aunt Betty who was an usher. And she used to write me letters and tell me about the theater. So I went around last night, not last night, a couple of months ago, and I said to one of the ushers, anybody ever hear of an usher named Betty Fields? And they said, well, yeah, she was at the Majestic for years. And they all remembered her, and they went around to tell Sally stories about her great, crazy Aunt Betty. And as it happens, Sally was appearing at the Golden Theater, and the Majestic Theater shares the same entryway, the same backstage corridor, but the backstage doors. And she said, my aunt and I both walked in and out of the theater on the same pathway.
I have one last quick question.
What? I love stories like that.
I love stories like that. I can't believe half an hour is over.
Yeah.
But if you could do one thing as a woman to change the theater right now, could you imagine what that could be? Snap your fingers and change it.
I don't think women are... I think we are getting into... Maybe the women can put that thing back in it that I find now missing, that sense of heart.
Yeah.
I find that the relationships between many of the unions and many of the producers are very fragmented, and in ways they never were. You know, in my day, a man knew the name of everybody who was on his payroll. Knew them by name, by sight, knew their kids. And that's kind of gone. And when that goes, when that fabric goes, and labor negotiations go into the hands of lawyers who know nobody, then somehow or other the friction starts. And I really think we need women to take a much, much more active role.
I love that.
You know, they got to get in there. I mean, you know, this business that women can't count. Oh.
I know, ridiculous. I know. Thank you so much, Liz McCann. I really, really had a wonderful time. Thank you for joining us. On behalf of the League of Professional Theater Women, I'm Linda Weiner, and this has been Women in Theater.